And once again, welcome back to the present. Again, right? I like that first video. Didn't like the second one so much. Actually, that first video was a little bit long, but it comes across in sort of the way that I was intending for it to come across, which is that when we look at Rambert, right? When we, as people who are looking at existentialism and looking at the existentialist ideals as they're presented in Sartre's worldview and in Kierkegaard's worldview, we the important thing is the free will, the entirety of the choice being ours, right, to make, and the entirety of the responsibility coming back to us, right? And certainly in Kierkegaard's view, the idea of grace, right, and forgiveness for mistakes being made, because we will often make great big mistakes. And so for Rambert, right, we do understand that his decision is 100% his, and that we can certainly judge the earlier actions, but maybe see this as a mark of maturity, right? That he has decided to stay and help out, because if it was just simply, well, I can't do anything about it, I guess I'll help out anyway, that feels like it would be a little bit less of something that maybe an existentialist would appreciate. They might think of that more as bad faith. When it comes to Paneloux, however, we, I think, have a complicated relationship with Paneloux in this particular book. We've talked already or I've talked already a little bit about this idea that Paneloux's situation is difficult because we don't know as much about him as I think we'd like to, but he is presented in such a way as to, this video series right here is the one that always things are kind of happening off screen. But that Paneloux has a religious mindset, right? For Kierkegaard, we may even look at Paneloux and see that in Kierkegaard's estimation, right, Paneloux looks at this as a sign of judgment, and that he looks at it as a sign that the people are being punished and simply must repent, right? It's sort of your classic, maybe not with as much brimstone, but your classic sort of fire and brimstone sermon, right? Repent, or, when you die, bad things will happen to you. And so we might not look at this and say, we love what's going on. And even Kierkegaard, as I said, might not love it, because for Kierkegaard, we remember that Kierkegaard's brand of existentialism, even though it does include God, and it includes grace, and it includes forgiveness, it does not seem that Kierkegaard puts as much of an emphasis on these events being created by God himself, right? Certainly, I don't think that Kierkegaard disbelieves that, God acts in the world. Certainly, I think that's an important, aspect of most modern Christianity, is that God continues to act in the world. But the fact that Paneloux seems to indicate in much of his interacting with other people in this book, the fact that he seems to act as if he believes that we are kind of powerless against this whole thing, does not, I think, sit well with Kierkegaard. Probably would not sit well, with Sartre either, right? Paneloux eventually does act. He eventually does show up and work in the clinics and pray for people and bring spiritual healing and guidance. And in a way, sure, I think we can reconcile a few things there. If we look at it from purely Sartrean point of view, his actions are to show up, right, and to provide the spiritual comfort that people have come to expect, and he truly believes in what he believes in, and certainly his actions are his own, and he takes he takes those actions very seriously. Um, but overall, right? And this is where I think I always have difficulty trying to talk about Paneloux in this particular book. His actions, his death, his reaction, right, to a young child dying horribly of the plague are certainly tests of faith, right? Does Paneloux ever lose his faith? He does not. I think this may be something Sartre would very much appreciate. Now, to be fair, we remember Sartre did not write this book. This is a Camus book. Camus wrote this, and so this would be something that Sartre would not have had a hand in designing, and so I think his reaction to it could be very neutral and very unprejudiced, I suppose, right, by his own interactions. That Sartre may very well look at it and say, Paneloux continues to believe in a God that he may have a crisis of faith with after seeing, right, the young child die horribly. And for Sartre, that may be a very noble thing. Sartre may believe it's very stupid, but he also may believe it's very noble in that Paneloux is tested and believes enough, right, to continue with his belief system, right? He continues to agree that this is still something that he will follow. This is still a God he's willing to follow, even though he sees horrible things happening that God has not stopped. Correct, quote unquote. So really, right, our two examples that we've seen so far with Rambert, Paneloux. Rambert has a very traditional sort of arc, right? I'm here, I'm unhappy, I want to leave. I start making plans to leave. I start thinking about what my role is here in town, and I decide I'm going to stay and help because I see a place for me and I see a way for myself to be useful. Right, sort of an arc that we may even expect, right, out of him, or that we may hope for him. With Paneloux, right, two sermons, one that is definitely more fire and brimstone, the second that is a little bit more tempered, but that is still insistent on people not losing faith, people finding something to take away from this pandemic, right, and then, right, a very difficult encounter with death and with illness, and his own illness and death, during which it is inconclusive whether or not he did have the plague or not, but his death comes anyway, right? And he dies believing in the God that he chose to follow. Like I said, I don't think there's any one answer here. I think that our interpretations of it really depend on how we feel about the existentialism that we've been looking at, right? I think that if we do look at it from more of a, responsibility, for yourself, your actions, and for, what you do and how you act in the world, are Rambert and Paneloux similar in their actions? Right? Rambert eventually helps out. He decides to jump in and to participate in helping out with the pandemic. Paneloux feels as if he is never really not, because he has provided this spiritual guidance. We don't see him, right, necessarily going out and ministering to the sick, but he is there, right? And he has his job. So, right, I think that makes this a bit of a complicated situation, but one that is very worth looking into and considering, right, from all those different points of view. When we start this next video, I do want to talk about Rieu, the end of the book, and what we may want to take away from it. So yes, we'll do that.